again after we finish going over all of the data, because there is a ton of data here. And the messages are being recorded as well. And it's, so yeah, let's get started. And so welcome. This is Research and Planning's Wyoming Tourism and Hotel Industry webinar. I'm going to be your guide through all of this information. My name is Caitlin Fahler. I'm a senior economist at Research and Planning, part of the Department of Workforce Services. Our office is in Casper. I've been with Research and Planning for 5 years. I have a background in geology and economics. I actually started my career in uranium mining. I'm curious about everything, and fun for me is making complicated data more easily accessible to busy people. I know information can be overwhelming, and I want to empower you to ask questions and seek answers. At Research and Planning, we just do the numbers. We don't run any programs out of our office. Our funding isn't tied up in how well a program works, so we can more honestly evaluate it. A lot of our office's funding is federal. We work with administrative data, considered the gold standard of data, as well as surveys, and we ensure stringent confidentiality is maintained and make sure no business, employee, employer, or student is identified as we discuss trends. And I'm here to help you get the information you need to make the best decision for you. Tourism is such a big topic, and I've tried to focus our questions for today into 3 main areas. First, we'll talk about the role of tourism in Wyoming. It's broad, it's complex, and not everyone means the same thing when they say tourism. Second, we'll focus on hotels, motels, campgrounds, and similar businesses, collectively and officially known as the accommodation industry. I chose to focus on accommodation as a subset of tourism because the accommodation industry is well defined, it employs a lot of people, and depends heavily on travelers and tourists. We'll compare Wyoming's growth to surrounding states, and we'll compare the industry between counties in Wyoming, as well as between seasons. Finally, we'll discuss some national and statewide trends in employee wages, demographics, turnover, injury rates, projected growth of key occupations, as well as local tax rates and the use of seasonal work visas in different areas of the state. Some of the findings here may not surprise you, which is good. That means you know what's going on in your business and you're aware, but some of this information may be unexpected. And that's also good. Surprising data can help us look at our observational blind spots and challenge us to take on a bigger picture, or it can force us to dig deeper into the data and ask why. One thing I try to do here is be as explicit as possible with how all of these figures in this presentation were created. Most of this data is publicly available, and I encourage you to use this information to make your decisions for your situation. If you can't find something, please do give us a call and let us help you. A lot of firms commissioned to perform studies begin by using public data anyway. On the other side of that, you can give us a hand too. I don't work in a tourism-related industry, and I never have, which means that I have blind spots of my own. If you notice something I have overlooked, please share with all of us. I want to hear it. It makes me a better researcher, and it will allow us to have a good discussion about new aspects of the data that I could not have brought up on my own. And again, use the chat feature to participate throughout this. Please, many of you have already let me know who is watching with you and where you're watching from. I really appreciate that. It really helps with my reporting, helps me get information back to the people who need it. So if you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat window, do that now. In this presentation, I'm using information mainly from the Occupational Employment Statistics Program, the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, projections, and the Survey of Occupational Illnesses and Injuries. I think it's important when using data to understand how these numbers are compiled. So if you decide, so that way you can decide with that understanding which method better captures what you're looking for over another. If you'd like to know more about these programs, please review our past webinars where I talk about how all of these things are counted. I've included links to the previous webinars in the notes for this slide, which I will send out after the presentation. And so you can go back and look and review any of that information. And thanks, Peg, for introducing yourself. It's good to have you here from Sheridan. All right, before we go any further, we do need to have an important discussion on the distinction, the difference between occupation and industry. To sum it up, an occupation is how you make money, and an industry is how your company makes money. For example, according to the Standard Occupational Classification Code definition, someone who works as a housekeeping cleaner, someone who has the occupation of a maid or housekeeping cleaner, makes money by cleaning rooms and halls, vacuuming and replenishing linens, and so on. A cleaner can work for many different types of companies, and that company may make money as a hotel or a motel where half of maids and housekeeping cleaners are employed nationwide. They may make money as a nursing home where 13% of maids are employed, or as a hospital, or for a company that cleans offices and homes, where another 11% each of cleaners work respectively. Wages are often different in each industry. For example, hospitals pay housekeeping cleaners almost $13 an hour, but businesses that service buildings pay under $11 an hour. Thanks, Leslie from Jefferson County, Lisa as well, and Penny, thanks for introducing yourself in the chat box. If you haven't done so, again, please do that. As we go on to our first question, what is the role of tourism in Wyoming? One of the things I've heard many places is tourism is the second largest industry in Wyoming. I wanted to verify this, and one of the first problems I ran into was, well, what does it mean to be the second largest industry in Wyoming? Does that mean the second greatest number of jobs, second highest wages, second most taxes generated, second most likely to cause a ripple effect of spending, second greatest number of businesses? The details of what it means to be the second largest industry are important, but it's not clear what this means when people say in general, tourism is the second largest industry in Wyoming. And further, what is included in tourism? And what became to me about defining tourism is that it's not clear. There's no clear definition of the tourism industry, even within Wyoming, and definitely not when we try to compare what we call tourism in Wyoming to tourism in other states. And that's not from lack of trying on anyone's part. Many professional researchers, including us at Research and Planning, use the very official North American Industry Classification System, which details over 1,000 specific industries. And the classification system does not have a tourism industry. It does have breakouts for casino hotels, drinking places, air transportation, souvenir stores, car rental agencies, ski facilities, nature parks. And these specific breakouts all fall into widely different broad categories like transportation, food service, accommodation, retail. What is often called the, quote, tourism industry ends up being a lot of different industries where travelers spend money. And that makes it complex to study because it means finding a way to estimate how much of each category can be attributed to travelers, because don't forget, each of these businesses provide services to travelers and to locals. WB asked, maybe I missed this, but what was the average wage for housekeeping in Wyoming in hospitality? And we're going to get to that, WB. That was just an example of how wages differ by industry. Thank you for the question. I really appreciate that. So we have all of these different industries that contribute to tourism in general, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis makes national estimates for how much tourism and the output of tourism contributes, how much of each of these industries can be attributed to what they call visitors, or people who are not local, but who are traveling for business or pleasure. They've come up with the tourism industry ratio. The Bureau of Economic Analysis uses these ratios to estimate that nationwide 74% of employment and accommodation can be attributed to tourism spending. An estimated 15% of output of food service and drinking places is because of visitors. These estimates are made primarily through national surveys, and knowing these estimates are compiled using national survey data can allow us to make reasonable assumptions about using the data. For instance, In Teton and Park counties, one could reasonably assume that significantly more than 3% of retail spending is due to visitors, especially in the summer. Perhaps in winter in Niobrara County, well under 15% of earnings for food service and drinking places can be attributed to tourism. What this emphasizes, though, is that not all spending in these categories is done by visitors or can be attributed to visitors, and that there's no clear universal definition of what makes up the tourism industry. This lack of context, this lack of clarity means that information can be skewed, but often skewed unintentionally, just for not understanding the context of the data. If you've been to our past webinars, you've probably heard me say context is important, and understanding the tourism industry is no different. In the end, I was only able to come up with one way in which the tourism industry could be said to be Wyoming's second largest industry. If one took all of the jobs in all of the businesses that fall into the big umbrella category called leisure and hospitality and attributed all of that employment to tourism, then Wyoming's second biggest private industry is leisure and hospitality, behind all jobs in retail and all of retail and wholesale trade, transportation, warehousing, and utilities. Leisure and hospitality does include a lot of tourism-related businesses, but calling all of leisure and hospitality tourism is not accurate, first of all, because locals use much of the same businesses that cater to tourists. And second, just counting leisure and hospitality omits other industries like car rental agencies, air transportation, and some retail. Further, the quarterly census of employment and wages counts the number of jobs in an industry, not the number of people working. And as we'll see in a bit, many more people than average in tourism-related fields work multiple jobs. We also have to acknowledge that leisure and hospitality did not generate the second highest wages in Wyoming, nor did it have the second highest number of businesses in 2017. As there is no clear definition of a tourism industry, we do our best to approximate, and it's not unusual to use leisure and hospitality to estimate tourism. We've done it in the past at research and planning, but also while acknowledging that not all of leisure and hospitality employment is attributable to visitors. For the sake of context and clarity, the rest of this presentation will largely focus on the private accommodation industry that employs a lot of people in Wyoming and depends heavily on visitors. In Wyoming, 90% of the accommodation jobs are in hotels and motels, and there's a lot to talk about when it comes to tourism accommodation, and national tourism trends can heavily influence local demand for hotel rooms. Demand for hotel rooms and accommodation services and tourism-related services in general is affected by a number of national and international factors, not the least of which is the price of oil, a double-edged sword in Wyoming. When gas prices are high, plane tickets and gasoline are more expensive. Foreign tourists may be less likely to visit. Domestic travelers from other states may be less likely to take road trips. On the other hand, Wyomingites may be more likely to travel, as income for many households in Wyoming is related to the price of oil. The value of the dollar relative to other currencies may also influence demand for hotel rooms nationwide, as well as in Wyoming. When the value of the dollar compared to other currencies is higher than usual, foreigners may decide to visit other places where their money can go further. When the dollar is weak, there's generally more foreign tourism spending. And nationwide, most tourists come from Canada, Mexico, the UK, Japan, and China. And those are statistics from 2017. The ease with which foreign travelers can obtain a US tourist visa, also commonly known as a B2 visa, can influence demand for hotel rooms in tourist areas. In many cases, as a foreigner, you must travel to a US consulate in your country of origin for an interview before you are granted a tourist visa. If you're traveling as a group and one person in the application process is denied a tourist visa, the whole group can be denied and you have to begin the process again. Closer to home, pipeline and other construction projects can bring a lot of workers to an area and fill hotel rooms. Possibly a lot of what's happening in Converse County right now can be attributed to construction and pipeline projects. If there's a national park, the national park designation over a national monument can can change the number of visitors to an area drastically, and that can change the demand for hotel rooms. You may also get more visitors if your area is easy to get to or along an interstate highway. Or visitors may depend on climate, snowfall, the amount of time people have off of school or work, personal income, the availability of jobs with sufficient wages to travel, and the availability of independent home sharing services like Airbnb and VRBO. All of these things can influence demand for hotel rooms, accommodation, and other tourism-related services. And on the other side of this, of customers' demand for accommodation services, is the supply and demand of workers, which we will discuss in a bit. We've had some more people join us on chat and let me know where they're watching from. Very helpful. Thank you so much. Very glad you're here. And please do use the chat to ask questions and let me know who you're watching with. To wrap up our section on the role of tourism in Wyoming, one of the important things to keep in mind is that the tourism industry does not have a consistent definition. And this inconsistency, for instance, can make an apples-to-apples comparison of tourism between states very difficult. Often the big umbrella industry of leisure and hospitality is used as a broad stand-in. And of all the umbrella industries, leisure and hospitality has the second most jobs, but it has fewer businesses and lower earnings than many other broad industries. And not all business conducted within leisure and hospitality, not all that spending is done by visitors. Much of it is done by locals. And we have estimates on that based on the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which releases national estimates. And finally, to sum it up, things that happen outside of Wyoming can have a major effect on tourism demand in our state, as well as the supply of labor, which we will continue to discuss. Questions on this section? Questions broadly before we move on to our next question? Okay, moving on. Next, we're going to compare Wyoming's accommodation industry. And we'll compare Wyoming to other states, we'll compare counties within Wyoming, and we'll compare counties between seasons. I'll be referring to the private or non-government accommodation sector for the most part, which, as I said, is made up of 90% of jobs in hotels and motels, but also includes RV parks and campgrounds. Tourists, as one would traditionally think of them in Wyoming, aren't the only people who use hotels and motels. This is much of what you're likely to see if you're near the economic engine that is Yellowstone National Park, but other types of visitors use accommodation businesses as well, and the profile of an area's visitor may depend on where you are. Along an interstate route, you may be getting more people passing through. In Cheyenne, one would expect to see more government-related visitors, and if there's a pipeline construction or a rig operating nearby, you may be host to a lot of workers visiting that area. The quote tourist or visitor is not going to look the same everywhere, and that goes for our border states as well. Wyoming has had some ups and downs since 2011 that our border states have not had. Overall, while the number of accommodation businesses is still growing in Wyoming, it's growing at about half the national pace. Same with accommodation employment. Montana and Utah of our border states had a much higher rate of growth in the number of accommodation businesses than the national average. But despite slower growth in Wyoming, Wyoming has over triple the concentration of accommodation businesses than the national average, and that is surpassed only by Alaska. No other state comes close to having triple the national concentration of accommodation businesses in 2017. With over triple the concentration in accommodation businesses comes triple the concentration in employment. According to the quarterly census of employment and wages, in Wyoming, 4.2% of employment is in accommodation, and this is a very large number, 3 times the national average, and up there with Nevada, the Virgin Islands, and Hawaii. Montana and South Dakota also have a high percentage of accommodation employment than the national average, and Nebraska has the lowest of our border states. An important thing to keep in mind here is that this is the annual average of the number of jobs, and the quarterly census of employment and wages, the source of these statistics, does not differentiate between full-time and part-time jobs. For most areas, there are fewer accommodation jobs outside the summer travel season. Tourism and accommodation in general are seasonal industries with one clear season, summer. Some states in the Rocky Mountain region, however, are lucky enough to have two seasons, summer and ski season. Wyoming is one of those dual season states. Wyoming's accommodation industry is especially seasonal, and this graph shows average monthly employment in accommodation in Wyoming, corresponding to the numbers on the left. Employment tops out in July each year, bottoming out in November, then coming up a bit in ski season. On average, employment in the off-season decreases by over 40% when compared with peak employment. Not so nationally, however. Nationally, accommodation employment peaks in July as well, with a low in January, but the difference between high and low employment is around 12%, and that's much different than Wyoming's 40% fluctuation. Just as there are major important differences outside Wyoming, inside our state there are also enormous differences between counties. Let's start with just the numbers. According to the quarterly census of employment and wages, for each month between January 2011 and September 2018, Wyoming had an average number of accommodation jobs of just under 12,000. Niobrara County had the lowest monthly average accommodation jobs, and not too different than Goshen County, under 50 in both cases. On the other side of the state, however, things look vastly different. Teton County has the highest average monthly employment, over 150 times that of Niobrara County. In fact, at any point in the given year, 1 in 4 jobs are in accommodation in Teton County. Teton County had the 11th highest accommodation job concentration of all counties in the United States, and the 10 counties with a higher concentration had a much smaller population than Teton County. Counties in Montana and Idaho bordering Teton County also did not come close to Teton County's share of accommodation jobs. However, the next closest county to Teton County in terms of accommodation employment was Park County. Park and Teton counties are the only counties who had an average monthly employment during this time period in accommodation of over 1,000. 8% of Park County Wyoming jobs were in accommodation, and a similar concentration of 10% in Park County, Montana. Park County, Wyoming had 8% of jobs in Park County, Wyoming were in accommodation, and a similar concentration of 10% of jobs in Park County, Montana were also in accommodation. Carbon, Johnson, and Hot Springs County had many fewer jobs in accommodation overall, but still had a higher concentration of jobs than the state's average of 4.2%. We know that nationwide there's a 12% fluctuation in accommodation employment throughout the year, and Wyoming has about a 42% fluctuation. And every county except for Goshen County had more fluctuation than the national average, but not all were at the state's average of 42% fluctuation in employment. For Wyoming, the counties that had relatively high accommodation employment and a seasonal fluctuation of less than 20% were Sweetwater County, Natrona County, and Laramie County. These counties have more jobs in summer, yes, but the seasonal swing was not as big as other counties. The 3 most seasonal counties with relatively high year-round employment were Carbon, Teton, and Park counties. Carbon County with a 43% difference from their high in August to their low in February. And Teton County had a low in November after most people have stopped harassing the bison and ski season hasn't started yet. And accommodation employment was 58% lower in November than in July in Teton County. Teton County is the county responsible for Wyoming's dual seasonality. So from behind my computer, I was definitely startled by this number. Accommodation employment fluctuates 72% in Park County between their high and low. And that just really startled me, although I'm sure that this is not surprising to any residents of Park County. Taking a look at this map, I think this is where assessing the type of visitor common to each area can be very, very important to understanding the data. This graph shows the variation in average weekly wages between a county's high and low paying quarters, and it also marks the annual average weekly wages. The data is an average of the years 2011 to 2017. Albany County had the lowest dollar fluctuation of any in the state, only $23 between their high and low seasons. Albany County accommodation workers generally have among the lowest weekly wages in the state, less than $300. And Uinta, Lincoln, and Bighorn counties all have similar annual averages of less than $300 per week. But Uinta, Lincoln, and Bighorn counties have seasonal earnings fluctuations of closer to $100 a week, much more than the $23 a week fluctuation we've seen historically in Albany County. Converse, Crook, Sheridan, Washakie, and Fremont counties have similar average earnings in the low 300s per week, and about a 12 to 15% fluctuation in wages between their high and low seasons. Johnson and Hot Springs counties have similar earnings and large seasonal fluctuations close to 25% between high and low seasons. Like Albany County, Natrona, Platte, Sweetwater, and Campbell counties also have low seasonal wage fluctuations of 10% or less. Stark and Carbon counties have the greatest seasonal earnings differences between accommodation workers in the state, with over $150 difference in weekly earnings between the off-season and the peak season. It's no surprise that Teton County has the highest annual average weekly wage, heavily skewing Wyoming's average because of the very high accommodation employment and relatively higher earnings in Teton County. From high to low quarters, there was about a $58 difference in weekly wages in Teton County. Omitting Teton County, Wyoming's accommodation earnings and employment and tourism profile would look very different. In 2017, Wyoming's annual average weekly wage for jobs in accommodation industry was about $477, half that of all jobs in Wyoming. Accommodation jobs across the nation generally are paid about half of average. Wyoming's weekly wage, which was significantly elevated by the higher wages in Teton County, is pretty much the middle of the pack for our region, but less than the national average weekly wage of almost $600 per week for accommodation jobs. Keep in mind, this is a measure of earnings by job, regardless of whether or not that job was full-time. As we review our second question, how does Wyoming's accommodation industry compare? We know that Wyoming has triple the employment concentration as the national average, the highest in the region, triple the business concentration, and triple the seasonal fluctuations. Accommodation employment and wages and the number of businesses are all growing in Wyoming, but they're growing at a slower pace than the nation, and a slower pace compared with most of our surrounding states. I hope I've been able to show you how Teton County drives much of the statewide statistics in terms of average wages and total employment and seasonality. And finally, visitor profiles vary depending on where you are in Wyoming, as do worker profiles. And in the next section, we'll take a closer look at occupations, demographics, and wages in the accommodation industry. Are there any other questions I can get to at this point? Anything that sparked your interest, surprised you, or maybe you guys in Park County can jump in and let me know how you are not surprised by the 72% fluctuation in accommodation employment. I can get to any of those questions at any time, and we will definitely have questions at the end. For our last question, what are some important accommodation employment trends? There's a lot to consider here. We mostly saw data just now from the quarterly census of employment and wages in the last section, but we have a lot of other tools at our disposal to examine the accommodation industry. And one of the drawbacks of the quarterly census of employment and wages is that it looks at employment and wages by industry and not by occupation. In our look at key employment trends, we're going to examine some occupational information. These 4 occupations make up the these four occupations make up half the jobs available in hotels and motels in Wyoming. A quarter of jobs in accommodation are maids and housekeeping cleaners, and then we have desk clerks, maintenance workers, and restaurant servers. These numbers are measured by the 2018 Occupational Employment Statistics Survey. This demographic data comes from the 2018 Current Population Survey, and this data is based on responses from anyone working in these jobs, regardless of the industry in which they worked. Nationwide, 47% of workers are women, 17% of workers identify as Hispanic or Latino, and the median age of workers was 42. For maids and housekeeping cleaners, 90% of people working as maids were women in 2018, and about half identified as Hispanic or Latino. The workers for maids and housekeeping cleaners tended to be a bit older. Front desk clerks tended to be younger, but still predominantly female, and general maintenance workers were clearly mostly men. About 1 in 5 of general maintenance workers identified as Hispanic or Latino, and again tended to be older than average. Servers were typically younger and female. And what we can see from this information is that these jobs are typically worked by women, and that more people in these occupations identify as Hispanic or Latino than in the workforce in general. These occupations vary in wages as well. The Occupational Employment Statistics Program estimates wages for occupations across all industries. And just as WB asked us earlier, one of the questions we get a lot is something like, hey, can you tell me how much housekeepers are making in hotels in Converse County? And unfortunately, the Occupational Employment Statistics Program only estimates wages for an occupation across all industries for an area. And that information is only released if it meets certain standards to ensure that we don't identify workers or employers with public information. In Wyoming, we unsurprisingly run into this a lot where data is confidential because we're a small state and I don't have access to this non-disclosable information. So if you call me, which you should, I'm happy to help you find what you need or brainstorm ideas for measuring difficult things. But please know that I'm not hiding information from you. We take confidentiality very seriously. Wyoming's median hourly wage across all industries in Wyoming was $19.34 an hour, and these occupations here typically have lower than average wages. Maids and housekeeping cleaners were paid an estimated $11.69 per hour in Wyoming in May 2018. Front desk clerks earned slightly more each hour. Maintenance workers across all industries earned the highest hourly wages of these four here, $17.87. And across all industries, servers earned the least according to the Occupational Employment Statistics Program. Lower jobs are often correlated with higher turnover or people coming and going from a job. Turnover isn't just driven by employees leaving their employer, but by employers cutting hours and wages based on seasonality, among other factors. In the long run, turnover can be related to a weaker attachment to the area's labor force. Regardless of who leaves or is let go, turnover is a major aspect of the leisure and hospitality industry, and it's important to keep in mind when we look at expectations for how much hospitality workers are actually earning. In addition to the quarterly census of employment and wages and the Occupational Statistics Program, Research and Planning also has information from employers' quarterly unemployment insurance tax filings, which is what allows us to follow trends in labor market movement. Movement as in when a worker leaves one industry, where do they go? How does employment stability vary by industry? In which industries are non-Wyomingites working, and who is working multiple jobs? Continuous employment or employment stability is one way to measure workers' attachment to an employer and to the labor force. We consider a quarter of continuous employment to be a quarter in which you were neither hired nor fired by your employer, so one in which you were just working along, not changing up your employment relationship. In 2017, the continuous employment ratio was 71% for all workers in Wyoming. Mining, except oil and gas, and hospitals had higher employment stability, and food, food and beverage stores had slightly less than average stability. Out of nearly 100 subsectors, accommodation was in the bottom 10 for employment stability and was definitely one of the largest in terms of employment industries that had that lower level of stability. What less employment stability often means is less attachment to the labor force. In 2017, the average number of quarters worked by all people who were employed at any point during the year in Wyoming was 3.24. People who worked only in accommodation worked an average of 2.56 quarters, and working fewer quarters translates into lower earnings. One of the things to be cautious about when using data about wages is determining whether or not that statistic is for people who work full-time year-round. Many times statistics of annual wages assume full-time work, which is not a reality for the average person who worked in Wyoming in 2017. Extrapolating on this statistic means that the average worker in Wyoming maybe only worked around 32 hours per week, and those working only in accommodation worked an average of 26 hours per week, maybe more in some months than in other months. We've seen that most jobs in accommodation have a median hourly wage that's less than the median hourly wage for all occupations. If people working in accommodation are typically working fewer quarters or fewer hours, that also decreases their earnings. In 2017, the median annual wages for all workers in Wyoming who worked for any length of time was over $24,000 each year. But the median annual wage for people who only worked in accommodation was about $7,500, even if they worked multiple jobs in the accommodation industry. And more accommodation workers than average do work multiple jobs. For all people who worked in Wyoming in 2017, 25% held 2 or more jobs, but 42% of individuals who worked in accommodation held 2 or more jobs in any industry. Almost 1 in 5 accommodation workers held 3 or more jobs, compared to less than 1 in 10 workers in Wyoming in general. Holding multiple jobs in a year is firmly correlated with lower wages compared with people who hold a single job. Accommodation workers often held jobs at multiple hotels and motels, but also at restaurants and bars, in building and cleaning services, with temp agencies, at recreation-related businesses, grocery stores, liquor stores, gas stations, and other retail outlets. I'm going to say what hiring managers already know here is that competition for workers can be higher, especially during the summer travel season. This, in part, is why our senators signed a letter, or it seems to be why our senators signed a letter in March of this year calling on the Department of Homeland Security to make more H-2B visas available, a type of seasonal work permit. In my research, I found that Wyoming businesses typically use 2 types of seasonal non-agricultural work permits, the H-2B visa and the J-1 visa. The H-2B visa is explicitly a work permit, while the J-1 visa is a work-study cultural exchange visa. For its population, Wyoming requested and was certified for a relatively large number of seasonal work permits from the Department of Labor's Office of Foreign Labor Certification in fiscal year 2018. And the number of requests Wyoming has been making in recent years has been rapidly increasing. For 2018, Wyoming businesses were granted 89% of the H-2B certifications that they requested, and that's a higher rate of approval than the US as a whole, where 75% of applications were approved. Teton County requested and was certified for more H-2B visas than all other counties in Wyoming combined. 94% of their requests were certified, and for a total of 463 positions, largely in housekeeping. However, only 2/3 of Park County's H-2B visas were requested. Far and away, the accommodation industry in Wyoming requests the most H-2B visas. And in Wyoming, the accommodation industry made a total of 60% of requests. However, nationwide, the accommodation industry only makes 12% of requests. This highlights how different Wyoming's workforce needs are. The J-1 cultural exchange visa has different subsets depending on the focus of the business or family making the request for the J-1 visa. Au pairs, for instance, can work for families using a J-1 visa, and most J-1 visas allow for a work-study component. There were more than quadruple the number of J-1 visas as positions certified for H-2B status in Wyoming for fiscal year 2018. Teton County leaned very heavily on J-1 visas. Park County did as well, but not to the same level. While no H-2B certifications appear to have been requested by Yellowstone National Park, 838 J-1 visas were used for Yellowstone in fiscal year 2018. In addition to foreign labor, Wyoming's accommodation industry uses a lot of out-of-state labor, and there's a very clear correlation. The more non-Wyoming residents working in an industry, the more turnover in that industry, which again is also correlated to fewer quarters worked and lower earnings. At Research and Planning, we keep track of fatal and non-fatal injuries in Wyoming as part of a national data collection effort with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this information is aggregated at the national level, and it shows that nationally, in 2017, maids and housekeeping cleaners, the most common occupation in the accommodation industry, were almost 3 times more likely than the average worker to suffer a recordable injury on the job, resulting in days away from work. The event that caused the injury was more likely to be a slip, trip, or fall, or being struck against an object like a cart or a mattress in the case of maids and housekeeping cleaners. The source of an injury for a maid and housekeeping cleaner was a piece of furniture or a fixture almost 9 times more than the source of injury than it was the source of an injury on average. Chemical injuries Injuries from chemicals were almost 7 times more common in maids and housekeeping cleaners than average. And one of the things that surprised me about injury rates and incidence rates overall for maids and housekeeping cleaners, a job often worked by vulnerable populations, was that the survey of occupational illnesses and injuries and illnesses shows that maids and housekeeping cleaners were less likely to suffer intentional injury by a person that resulted in days away from work. This is where understanding the methodology behind these statistics is important. These incidence rates we're discussing here are reported by employers, and only incidence resulting in days away from work are included here. Although it's a difficult topic to collect data on, news reports suggest that when maids and housekeeping cleaners, as well as janitors, face violence in the workplace, it's often perpetrated by their supervisor. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission handles complaints of harassment and assault, and much of that information is kept confidential, which further compounds issues of understanding non-reporting of sexual assault and harassment. I think this is important food for thought when we are looking at the data overall. Just because something isn't being measured doesn't mean it's not happening. I've included links to news reports in the notes on this slide for employers looking to understand more on this topic, as well as a link to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration's news release from July 2016, detailing OSHA's first and only citation to an employer for failing to prevent physical and sexual assault in the workplace. For businesses in leisure and hospitality in general, though, there is good news. You are projected to grow faster than average. Average growth is expected to be 2% between last summer and this summer, and leisure and hospitality is expected to grow 2.8%, or add about 1,000 jobs. And almost 300 of those jobs will be added in accommodation and about 500 in food service. Not all industries that travelers utilize, though, are expected to grow. Retail trade is forecasted to drop over 250 jobs from last summer to next summer, a decline led largely by general merchandise stores. These numbers are for jobs added or lost to an industry in total. Due to people leaving the workforce and switching jobs, however, there will definitely be more and have been more than 300 openings in accommodation between last summer and next summer. People who stay at hotels and motels in Wyoming are charged up to 10% in taxes for the cost of their room, depending on the county. This includes state sales tax of 4%, some optional county taxes, and a lodging tax rate of up to 4% in certain areas. 9 counties charge the maximum countywide additional lodging tax, which is 4%. And in other counties, municipalities and main districts also impose a 4% lodging tax rate. For instance, Teton Village and Grand Targhee in Teton County charge a 4% lodging tax rate in addition to sales tax and optional county taxes, but the county itself charges 2%. Other counties charge 2 or 3%, and in several counties, there's only a lodging tax in one municipality. It's difficult to judge the accommodation industry based on lodging tax collection because there is variation year to year in the level of lodging tax. According to current laws, the majority of the lodging tax, up to 90%, must go towards promoting tourism in that locality. Only 10% of the localities, only 10% of recovered lodging tax can go into that locality's general fund. If certain criteria are otherwise met, up to 30% of total collected lodging taxes can go towards funding bike paths, parking lots, museums, and other tourist amenities, but still only 10% can go into the area's general fund. It will come as no surprise to anyone that Teton County collects the greatest amount of lodging tax of any county in the state, more than the next 4 largest counties combined, which are Park, Laramie, Natrona, and Albany counties for fiscal year 2018. Montana does not have sales tax, but it does impose a statewide lodging and sales use tax of 7%, a large portion of which goes to fund tourism promotion. Montana allows municipalities to administer their own resort tax of up to 3%, which cities on Wyoming's border near Yellowstone and other resort area Montanas do collect. And that averages to about 10% in those areas. And that puts Montana's lodging tax rate in total very similar, just above the taxes on rooms for most Park and Teton County hotels. I appreciate you all sticking with me so far. Let's wrap up our last question. What are some important trends in accommodation employment? We covered that wages are generally lower in accommodation, turnover is typically higher, and more people work multiple jobs. Wyoming uses a lot of foreign worker visas for our size, and we also utilize a lot of out-of-state workers. And the most common occupation in accommodation, maids and housekeeping cleaners, those people who work that job are about 3 times more likely than average to be injured on the job. Finally, Wyoming law allows counties to collect up to 4% in lodging taxes, and up to 10% of that 4% can be used in the area's general fund. These trends are important to keep in mind when we talk about tourism as a means of building our workforce and bringing in different businesses. Many Wyomingites depend entirely on travelers to pay their bills, but as it stands, accommodation and related jobs in tourism are less stable and have lower wages. And having a higher concentration of less stable, low-wage jobs can have broad implications for educational institutions, social programs, and our unemployment insurance system. Any questions? We're nearing the end here. Appreciate you guys sticking with me. This afternoon, we discussed 3 big questions, and the first of which was, what is the role of tourism in Wyoming? We talked about how the tourism industry does not have a consistent definition which makes it hard to make direct comparison of tourism between states. We also talked about how national and international trends can affect tourism demand in Wyoming. To answer our question, how does Wyoming's accommodation industry compare? We noted that Wyoming has triple the concentration of accommodation employment, businesses, and seasonality, and that Teton County heavily influences statewide statistics. Lastly, when talking about important accommodation industry trends, we observed low job stability and low wages in accommodation and tourism-related jobs. And Wyoming also has a relatively high dependence on foreign and out-of-state. Wyoming has a relatively higher dependence on foreign and out-of-state workers. Normally, I include a sources slide at the end of this presentation, but the data for all of this was very involved and could not be contained in just one slide. So please look at the comments, the slide comments on each of these slides after you receive our follow-up email, which I will send out shortly. Other than that, if there's no questions, which I'm happy to hang out here with you all for a while, if you think of something else, please email or call me. My email is on the screen, as is my phone number, and give us a call and let us try and help you find what you were looking for. If you didn't before, let us, in the chat window, let me know who you watched with. Let me know where you're from. I really appreciate it for reporting purposes. Email me with any feedback you may have on this presentation. It was really great to have you, and really great to have you here for the past hour. Thanks, Kathy. I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you, Ruth. So glad you could join us for East Coast time. Thanks, Esther. I'm glad you could join us. Thanks, Mary Ellen. Thanks, Leslie. Really appreciate you guys joining us. It was nice to have you. Thanks, Christine. It's such a complex issue. Hopefully you can go and share the news that nobody really knows has a good definition of tourism, although I'd be happy to work with anybody who wants to try and come up with one. I'm glad you could join us. David, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. I always appreciate your input. Yeah, big industry super sectors can often mean very different things here in our small state, and we take that very seriously. So thanks for joining us, David. I see we still have a few people on the call. If anybody else would have any questions, feel free to write it in the chat box or send us an email.